Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Gunther Dog, and this is my local library, and this is going to be a 2019 favorites and surprises list. Alright, filming outside was getting me slightly too much unwanted attention, so I decided I'm going to film the rest of this indoors. This year was kind of an interesting reading year for me in that I think I rated more things 5 stars on Goodreads this year than I have in any of the years that I've been on Goodreads, and I've been on Goodreads since 2007. So that would suggest that it was a really good reading year, but I think that actually, I read a lot of things that I thought were very good, but that they weren't necessarily outstanding and going to be on a favorites of all time kind of list. So usually when I do a favorites list, I break it down by genre, but I'm going to break them down into slightly different categories this time. I'm going to start with books that I thought were absolutely fascinating, but that I would really only recommend to people who are interested in the subject matter. So the first of the 3 books that I'm going to mention in that category is Jean Moorcroft Wilson's new biography of Robert Graves. From the Great War Poet to Goodbye to All That, 1895 to 1929. This is the first volume in what will be a multi-volume biography. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you'll know I'm a huge First World War buff, and Jean Moorcroft Wilson's biographies of Siegfried Sassoon are just some of my absolute favorites when it comes to just biographies in general, but especially specifically First World War biographies, so I was very much looking forward to this, and I did thoroughly enjoy it. I think it's actually slightly more dry in parts than the Sassoon biography. So in this case, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this just to anyone who doesn't have an interest in the First World War writers. But if you do, I absolutely think this should be on your list of things to pick up, because it was wonderful. It did have so much extra information about Robert Graves in that specific period, because I think a lot of biographies of him will push into some of his later work, and he isn't framed as exclusively a First World War writer as some of his contemporaries were, and I think by breaking this biography up into pieces, similarly to her Sassoon biography, I think this gives some extra depth, so I thoroughly enjoyed this one. Another book that I thought was absolutely fascinating because I didn't know anything about the topic to begin with was The Trial of Hissène Habré by Celeste Hicks. The subtitle on that one is How the People of Chad Brought a Tyrant to Justice, and it is about human rights violations that happened in Chad and the leader who was brought to an international level trial, and the whole situation around that. Now, I knew virtually nothing about Chad's history going into this, so I thought this was absolutely fascinating. It is extremely dry. It's not written in a compelling way. It is not narrative nonfiction. It's not, and I don't think you would read this if you were not particularly interested in that aspect of either international law or that post-colonial history in Chad. But if you are interested in either of those things, I think this is well worth picking up. And finally, something that is somewhat more of popular interest, I think, is Michael W. Twitty's The Cooking Gene, a journey through African-American culinary history in the Old South. This is in part a family memoir, which I think is why I would call this more aimed at a popular audience than the other 2 books that I mentioned in this category. This is the author, who is a chef, going through the history of both his own genealogy and the general history of what's thought of as American Southern cooking, which was created out of the slave chefs in the pre-Civil War South, and the merging of West European, West African, and indigenous American cooking styles. It includes bits of recipes, it includes bits of the cultural history, a kind of ethnography of the South, and it includes the author's specific genealogy, where he looks into his ancestors, both his West African and European background, and digs into all of that. It is a very entertaining book. As I said, I think this one definitely could appeal to more of a popular audience than the other 2 books that I mentioned, but if you don't particularly care about food, I don't know that it would have as much of an appeal, but I definitely think if you're a fan of either cooking or genealogy, this is absolutely worth picking up. So the next category is going to be what I would call excellent and important. And the first of the 3 books in that category that I'm going to mention is Behrouz Boochani's No Friend But the Mountains. This was translated by Omid Tofighian, who also wrote a really extensive contextual translator's note at the end, to a point that I would almost say that this book was co-written by the 2 of them. It is a look into the refugee prison camps that Australia built in Papua New Guinea, and is a combination of almost journalism, memoir, and poetry. And it is a really interesting look at the way the human face of political actions. I know a lot of Australian booktubers have talked about this, but I think it deserves a lot more attention from non-Australians as well, because I think there is a tendency to talk about refugee situations and refugees en masse and not thinking about them as individuals. And I think this puts an individual's face on that really well. This is a book that was written in text messages and then pieced together and translated by the translator. It is a really interesting work in the context of that, in addition to being important for the subject matter. So I think it's well worth reading and worth thinking about. A more straightforward memoir that I would also heartily recommend in terms of being both quality writing and important is Scholastique Mukasonga's Cockroaches. This was translated by Jordan Stump, who has also translated a lot of Mukasonga's other work. This is a memoir of her family's life in Rwanda, primarily in the 60s and 70s. I think when we talk about post-colonial Rwandan history, there tends to be such an intense focus on the 1990s that it's easy to forget the history that happened in between, that there was something in between the colonial period and the genocide of the 1990s. And this puts, again, a very human face on that, as well as being a very compelling read. Mukasonga was someone who did lose 27 members of her immediate family in the 90s genocide, so it isn't to brush over the importance of that, because she does talk about that in the final chapters, but this really is about the communities and what was happening with them prior to that, and what the history is, and avoids making that jump that I think so many histories of Rwanda do. And the third book in this category is Valeria Luiselli's Tell Me How It Ends, an essay in 40 questions. This is basically an account of how Luiselli became a volunteer translator dealing with the processing of refugee children in the United States, which again is a refugee situation in which people talk about the group en masse, and she comes in here and puts human faces on these people. She also talks about the activism that her students at university have done as they've found out more about this, and I think that puts a more human face on the idea of on a kind of resistance movement to some of these things. It's easy to look at things that are happening in the United States and kind of wonder why people aren't doing things, and she draws attention to the fact that some people are doing things, more people could be doing things, as well as giving humanity to this group of asylum seekers who you see regularly in the news, but as a group and not necessarily as individuals. And this book in particular is exceptionally short, so it's a very quick read. Alright, so I'm on the topic of less heavy pieces. I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I thought were just delightful, that weren't necessarily perfect in every way, but that had bits that were just wonderful. And that includes my favorite mystery of the year, which was Sujata Massey's The Satapur Moonstone. This is the sequel to a book that, depending on which market you're in, was either called The Widows of Malabar Hill or A Murder on Malabar Hill. And that introduction was, by mystery standards, actually quite heavy. This does have serious social topics. This is set in India in the 1920s, and the sleuth is a female solicitor who is separated from her husband and in a situation where it's basically impossible for her to get divorced, and, you know, faces a lot of sexism for being one of the only female solicitors. And it deals with a lot of the class and colonial and social and religious and all of these issues in the background, while being a really entertaining and well-paced mystery. I think there are a lot of mysteries that, because they're sitting on this comfortable framework, just add a few bits and pieces for flavor, but I think this book really took the promise of the first one and is paying it off, and I really look forward to seeing the rest of the series, because I think this is done really well and balanced really well. Because I think there are some bits of genre historical fiction in which you read it and wish that it were straightforward historical fiction, and with this I don't feel that. I feel like there's a perfection to the mystery bits, which is not necessarily to insult genre fiction in which I wish it was straightforward historical fiction. There were two romances that I read this year that I kind of felt that way about, but I actually thought they were quite good, even though I wished they were a slightly different genre. Those were Beverly Jenkins' Forbidden, which is set in the post-Civil War United States, and the issue behind the romance in the story is that it's between a black woman and a mixed-race man who's passing for white, and he has to decide love or political career. However, what I loved about the setting was that it talks about basically this woman is building her business, this man is trying to do political and economic reforms, and all of that was fascinating. So I kind of wished that it wasn't a romance, just because I love those separate elements so much. But I think there's some power to loving individual elements. Another book where I loved a lot of the individual elements was Guillaume Long's To Eat and to Drink. This is a comic series in which he both recounts his adventures as a food critic, also involves food bits. The parts where he's talking about traveling to do food criticism and restaurant reviews is fun, but a little obnoxious in the way that I think one expects a restaurant reviewer to be. However, the moments where he talks about food, he has, for example, a one-page panel where he talks about how to make the perfect cup of coffee with an Italian coffee maker. He has another panel about when you first move out of your parents' house, or if you've just divorced and your ex-partner has taken all your kitchen stuff, here's what you need to buy. That is wonderful. And those bits are just fantastic. So even though I didn't love the critique bits, the parts in this that were wonderful were just wonderful. And then finally, I read a poetry collection this year called New Index for Predicting Catastrophes by Madhur Anand, which is nature poetry, but written not with an artist's eye, but with a botanist's eye. And it actually includes footnotes under every poem to journals of ecology and botany and things like that. I often talk about poetry in terms of who knows if it's really fiction or nonfiction, but this was a spectacular example of nonfiction poetry with references. I just loved what this was doing. I don't think the poetry was always 100% successful, but I just adored the whole idea behind it. And I thought, maybe not the best poetry I read this year, but definitely the most creative and unique poetry that I read this year. My next category is going to be compelling novels. There were a few novels that I read this year that I just absolutely adored, to a point that I canceled everything else I was doing because I just wanted to finish them. And I don't know if they are going to hold up as absolute favorites. They may not. But as I was reading them, I just thought they were incredibly successful. The first book in that category was Colson Whitehead's The Nickel Boys. This got a lot of attention this year, and I'm surprised it didn't end up winning any big awards, because I thought it was a really masterful piece of writing, as well as being stylistically interesting. It jumps back and forth in time, primarily follows a teenager who's been sent to a reform school, and this is the American South during segregation, and there are horrible abuses happening there. And then in addition to that, we get some portraits of working class New York City life in decades later. The book did have a twist that I thought was predictable, but despite that, I thought it was incredibly compelling. This was a book where I planned to read about 20 minutes over my lunch hour, and a couple of hours later, I was still sitting there reading this book because I just wanted to get through it. I can't say it was delightful because it is such a serious and dark subject matter, but it was a wonderful read, and it was really compelling. With that one, I wasn't particularly surprised that I found it that compelling. I do quite like Colson Whitehead's writing. Zone 1, I think, was just a masterpiece of literary zombie fiction. I don't think that's a subgenre, but if it were, that would be the best of them. So I wasn't surprised that I loved that, but one that I was surprised to have enjoyed as much as I did was Meg Medina's Burn Baby Burn. This is a young adult novel, which normally is the kind of thing that I approach as kind of a palate cleanser between the depressing nonfiction that I read. But this I enjoyed so thoroughly that I stayed up until 2 a.m. reading this, and I'm generally a morning person. I do not stay up late at night, but I just wanted to finish this. It is set in New York City during the 70s, during the summer where the Son of Sam killer was active, where there were riots and power outages. And so it reminded me in a lot of parts of the Spike Lee movie, The Summer of Sam, except with teenage girls instead of 20-something men. For me, the final couple of chapters of this book didn't really satisfy me, but I think that is purely because it is written for a teenage audience, and it does try to have a moral lesson in the end, which I didn't love. I still think it was successful for the intended audience, and I did still find this way more compelling than I ever expected. And I thought it gives the reader more credit than a lot of books for a teenage audience would, so I respect that about this too. It was highly entertaining. And finally, I think the most compelling book that I read this year was Ocean Vuong's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. This has gotten really mixed reviews. I have seen people who were okay with it, who also loved it, and who hated it. For me, it was just incredibly compelling. The writing style is very poetic and very fractured in bits, and often the writing talks around things. This is one where when I first talked about it, I said I can't really describe what it's about because it's not really about anything. We're following this main character who is clearly a semi-autobiographical type character through his mostly teenage life, interacting with primarily his mother, his grandmother, and his first boyfriend. Terrible things happen. This is not a happy or uplifting story, but it's just the moments worked for me. I have seen people who thought the writing in this was ridiculous and that the lack of plot was the opposite of compelling, but for me it just worked 100%, and I felt very absorbed in the thought processes of this character, which is kind of what you're being given. It's structured as a letter that's being written to the main character's illiterate mother, so the idea is she will never read this letter, but it really just feels like following this guy at random moments in his life, and I just loved it. I thought it was incredibly compelling, and it's another one where I started reading it over my lunch hour. I went to a coffee shop and meant to read it for about 20 minutes, and then I realized a couple hours later that I was still there because I just couldn't put this one down. I also wanted to mention 4 serial pieces that I really loved this year, 2 of which I read the final volume of, but 2 of which I'm still continuing with. The first of which was Gengar Tagami's My Brother's Husband. This a lot of people on BookTube have talked about. It is a manga series. It is 2 volumes in English, in the English translation. It's 4 volumes in the French translation, in which there's a single father living in Japan, and one day his dead brother's widower shows up, and he has to kind of figure out what his own feelings are about family. His daughter immediately accepts his brother's husband as uncle, and he has to work out why he has issues with this, because he doesn't see himself as being a homophobic person, but he's kind of working out the social picture and what else is happening, and they go buy donuts. So anything where people go buy donuts gets extra points. And the art style is lovely, although there are a few points where you go, yeah, I know this author usually draws porn, which he does. If you Google his work, you'll find some interesting stuff. Anyway, it is wonderful. Another series that I finished reading this year was The Wildstorm, which is written by Warren Ellis and drawn by John Davis Hunt. This is, of course, the reinvention of the Wildstorm universe, which I was a huge fan of in the 90s, and I love that they brought it back and reinvented it and really modernized it in ways that I think really worked. I think a lot of authors will do this kind of reboot, and it's just sad, and it's a sales pitch. And this felt like it was a genuine attempt to create a new story and new characters with these old characters. And I just loved every bit of it. I think it's a little slow going if you were reading it in the floppies, but now that they've all been collected, I think it is well worth picking up, even if you were someone who thought it was too slow at the beginning. It's a wonderful series. And I definitely think it's the best superhero series I've read in 15 years, easily. And then in terms of nonfiction comics, Riyad Sattouf's ongoing series of graphic memoirs, The Arab of the Future, are also wonderful. I am currently in the middle of volume 4. This is a series that details his life growing up in France, Syria, Libya. Eventually his father moves to Saudi Arabia and his parents divorce. And it's a great look at both a particular family, a particular series of places, and kind of the cultural attitudes that create the situations and the relationships that people have. It's just it's a wonderful portrait of the years in which he is growing up. And then finally, I'm going to talk about my actual favorites. Number 4 is Adam Pottle's The Bus. This is a very short novel that's written in 11 voices, primarily of the inmates of a mental asylum who are being sent to a gas chamber in Nazi-era Germany. It is horrifically depressing, but it is written from an angle that I think you very rarely see in Holocaust fiction, and I think it's really well done. It is the kind of book where someone could easily write about that topic, and because it's so rarely written about, it would be impressive just by virtue of what it is, but it is really compelling. The voices are differentiated, and I think are fair to the mental abilities or mental states of the characters without being patronizing, which I think is really well done. Adam Pottle was also sort of my author discovery of the year. I ended up reading his poetry collection, Beautiful Mutants, his memoir, Voice, and then I saw the play that he wrote, The Black Drum, as a musical that was written in ASL. So it's not, there are a lot of plays that are translated from a spoken language into a sign language, but this was conceived as a sign language musical. So all of the music is rhythm-based. It was really impressive stuff. But anyway, that particular book was one of my favorites, but I think he's also my favorite author that I hadn't read before that now I have consumed a lot of material from. My number 2 favorite was Haruki Murakami's memoir, What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. This is a memoir of his training for the New York City Marathon. It also discusses his writing process and compares that to triathlon training, but it's primarily about the New York City Marathon. I thought it was just a charming and accurate portrait of the attitudes that a lot of endurance athletes have. So even if you're not a marathoner, if you are someone who does other endurance sports, you will look at this and recognize either yourself or people that you know. This was a book that just had me grinning with recognition constantly. And I'm not even a fan of Murakami's novels, but I just loved this. It was wonderful. Favorite number 3 is another piece of depressing nonfiction, because we have to get back to that eventually. And that was Eji Tamel Karan's How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship. This is about the rise of populism, primarily in Turkey, but also in the US and the UK. And it looks at, in part, the way that people of a certain educational background tend to laugh at populist politicians at a certain stage in their increasing popularity and just don't take it seriously enough because it seems like such a joke to begin with, and how that happens in country after country and no one learns that you need to take it seriously earlier. And she does remind people who are not from countries with populist governments in power that there are still these people in our countries, and that we shouldn't be complacent and just point at other countries and laugh, because pointing at the populist parties in their own countries is where countries with current populist governments have perhaps gone wrong. In any case, I thought this was really compelling stuff and well worth reading if you are interested in that kind of political material. And finally, my favorite book of the year was Tommy Pico's Feed, which is a poetry collection. It is 78 pages and does almost exactly what Duck's Newburyport did in its 1,020 pages. It's kind of a stream of consciousness account of the main character or the author's life, connecting one thing to another and just going on. It was incredibly compelling. It was structured really nicely. I loved the way the language worked, and I felt drawn into it at the same time. I think it worked on multiple levels, and this was so successful in its 78 pages that it really lowered my opinion of Duck's Newburyport, that it could do the same thing in 78 pages that book took 1,000 pages to do. I thought this was just brilliant. I will link below to the wrap-up in which I talked about that, because I read about a page and a half of it so that you can get a sense of the language, but I just adored that. It was wonderful. So that is my list of favorites. If you've read some of these, I'd love to hear what you thought of them. I know some people hate the same kind of things that I love, and I think that's brilliant. I hope you had as good a 2019 reading year as I did. And yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.